brain seems to not be functioning. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce myself, and then I'd like for the panelists to introduce themselves. I'm Rebecca Hester. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society. I'm also the coordinator for the Medicine and Society minor. And so this is our first ever event that I'm calling, sort of in a cheeky fashion, the Medicine and Society Mashup, because it's meant to bring all different kinds of miscellaneous topics to the table. And so every month we'll be having conversations with different people with issues related to medicine and society. So today we have two medical students at Virginia Tech's Carillion School of Medicine who have offered to generously give their time for an hour. So I'll let you guys go ahead. Luma, why don't you start, and then we'll have Macy introduce herself, and then we can go from there.
Sure, sounds good. I'm Luma Abu Nimr. I'm a second-year medical student at Virginia Tech Carillion. And despite my very professional background, I'm not speaking on behalf of the School of Medicine, but I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
And my name is Macy Marcucci. Like Luma, I am a second-year medical student and very excited to chat for a little bit.
Good. Okay. So the subject of today's conversation is social justice advocacy from within medical school. What are some of the challenges and what are some of the opportunities for advocating for social justice for patients and even for doing social justice related community outreach work? So maybe you guys can just start talking about some of the opportunities, some of the things that you've been involved in, and then we'll get into kind of some of the challenges of doing it. So either one of you can go ahead, just tell us what you guys have been involved in, tell us what Carillion offers maybe, and then maybe what you know about other medical schools, what's available.
Do you want to start, Macy?
No, you go ahead. You've done your big health fair recently, so.
Okay, sure. So speaking first on what I've been involved in, I've primarily put my time into the Refugee and Immigrant Medical Association, which is a student club at VTC. And it sort of has a really wide goal in terms of what we do. So we partner with local organizations that are addressing refugee resettlement in Roanoke. And we also have a faculty mentor who is Dr. Parmashwar, who is a pediatrician at Carillion. So our work goes from anything in between sort of bridging medical students with local community needs. So we've had medical student volunteers sit in on Blue Ridge literacy classes. So for students that are learning English as a second language at all different levels, we've had sort of health literacy classes where medical students sit in. And most recently, we've just wrapped up a pretty large project that was a drive-through health fair. So that all started sort of at the beginning of the pandemic, which was, I guess, last March. Myself and my co-president, Sara Yosef, essentially were trying to figure out how to deliver this health fair, which had been an annual staple of this student club within the parameters of the COVID-19 pandemic. And Dr. Parmashwar had identified a lot of her patients that were struggling with food insecurity that was exacerbated by the pandemic. So we began by surveying a lot of the local food pantries in the area and figuring out what were the needs of the people who were coming to see them, what were their specific needs. And building off of that, we decided to focus on gathering food resources as well as health resources and delivering those to the community. So our target goal was 300 bags and $5,000, and we ended up exceeding that and raising over $10,000. And we actually just 2 weekends ago were able to distribute our bags full of stuff like thermometers, hand sanitizer, a lot of different non-perishable food items, and did sort of like a contactless drive-through. And all of that was made possible by our local partners. So we worked with Commonwealth Catholic Charities, Casa Latina, all these different groups that had already had contacts within the community. So that was a really awesome opportunity. But beyond REMA, I'm also involved in the Learning Environment Advocacy Committee, which is a student elected position. And it's more of an administrative role. in which it's a committee that I'm serving as a student representative on, and we get student reports of unprofessionalism, harassment, anything that might compromise the learning environment. And my role there is really just to offer the student perspective. And it's also has people from the deans of the school to physicians and attendings and residents at Carillion. So that's been pretty cool.
And so for my kind of big project that I've worked on for the past year or so, also kind of around the start of the COVID pandemic. So there is a free health clinic in Roanoke called the Bradley Free Health Clinic, and they serve uninsured and underinsured patients in the Roanoke area. There is a student organization called the International Health Clinic that's existed for the past few years that they have hosted clinic nights at Bradley for non-English speaking patients. It has kind of had been previously a little bit sporadic. Dr. Parmeshwar also was kind of an advocate for us if she identified a lot of patients that needed, for example, like students who needed to get a physical to go to school or do sports. We would host a physical night that it was just like students that were high school students coming in for a physical. At the start of the pandemic, we started seeing kind of our, like Luma, like our plans had to change, and we had an emergency medicine physician reach out to us, or kind of like reach out with REMA, Luma's organization, and say that they're really identifying a lot of patients coming to the emergency department who are non-English speaking patients. They do not have primary care physicians. A lot of them are coming in just because they think they might have COVID, but they don't really know where to go. They don't have resources to get a test or things like that. So we started building a monthly clinic through Bradley Free Clinic, but under like the moniker of International Health Clinic. And we are specifically now, because it's kind of like a pilot of only serving Spanish speaking patients. We're hoping to expand it. We're limited by resources, limited by kind of the time and resources that Bradley can share with us. But it now looks like last night had our 7th clinic. So it's monthly, working with, we call patients that were seen in the emergency department who are Spanish speaking and who do not have primary care physicians, and offer them a chance to come to a clinic. It's been really wonderful because we've been able to establish care with a lot of patients who have become regular patients at Bradley, gotten referrals for imaging, for OB-GYN, for prosthetics, for dental. So that's kind of our big work that we've been doing in that space, and that I've been spending a lot of time on in the past year or so.
Awesome. So can you guys talk about some of the other stuff that's happening at Carillion, or that you know about, and some of your friends or colleagues or peers at other medical schools, some of the things that they're involved in, so that students watching this can get a sense of, what are some possibilities that I can go into medical school thinking about?
Another kind of area that I do work in, I don't do as much extensive work in, but kind of advocacy, is I am a co-leader of the Medical Students for Choice, which works on reproductive justice and access to abortion care. This is an international organization, so there's a lot of chapters at various medical schools, and I've been connected with medical students at other schools who are doing a lot of advocacy work, both in changing curriculum, which we are trying to do at VTC, and we're using what previous other schools in our area and in the country kind of have already made a blueprint of how to navigate working with administration, working with physicians, working with professors, working with students, to integrate work that everyone might not agree with, but then also like advocacy work through Planned Parenthood and things like that. So that's one kind of another avenue. I know Luma and I have kind of discussed refugee and immigrant health, but another aspect. And then another thing is, I think with this past summer with the Black Lives Matter protest, both at Virginia Tech, Carillion, and at other medical schools, some medical schools, there's been some push to be more cognizant of how those institutions are interacting with those movements and prioritizing Black lives and other kind of like BIPOC identities that need to be prioritized in these settings.
Yeah, definitely. So I also forgot to mention the Roanoke Refugee Partnership, which is a huge partner for REMA and also for the medical school in general. But in terms of other opportunities that have been going on, Virginia Tech Carillion has a VTC Unfinished series, which I've been a little bit involved in. It's actually student led, but it's funded and backed by the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And that's an opportunity for medical students to explore different areas that they don't feel was touched in as much emphasis maybe, or not covered at all within our traditional curriculum. So an example of some of the events I've helped to put on, we had like a Black maternal health panel just last month. Before that, we had an Unpacking 2020, which was more of like a dialogue style event in which REMA partnered with the Asian Pacific American Medical Association and the Student National Medical Association. So that was a really cool opportunity to sort of sit down and within the medical education realm, talk about how this has affected us as students, and as Macy was talking about, sort of on the system level also. And I think there are just a lot of students in general who have been taking responsibility and taking it upon themselves to push the boundaries and demand change in a really remarkable way. And one of those students was my co-leader, Sara Yosef, and some of her also partners in the Student National Medical Association helped to create change within the Carillion system itself. A lot of the some of these clinical criterias are based in race. One of those was the GFR measurement, which is a measure of kidney function, and they help to bring attention to Carillion in the fact that patients were designated as either Black or non-Black, and based on that criteria, they would adjust their GFR, so their kidney function, and that would actually affect patients' level on the transplant list. So I just wanted to shine a light on some of those individual student activists who have like really done amazing work and created change within Carillion. So yeah, I think those are some of the big things, but in addition to like those organizations that we've mentioned, there are also a lot of individual students who can be activists in their own right. So
Good, thank you. I want to just pause here and see if Kara or Claire have any questions that they want to ask thus far, or things that you want to hear the panelists talk about before we move on to some of the challenges.
Do you have any advice on how we as undergrads can get involved in things like that?
I do. So actually, I'll be partnering with their faculty, the mentor that they've been working with through REMA and through these other kinds of the Bradley Freed Clinic and other kinds of endeavors. Dr. Permeshwar and I will be working together next year to start partnering with the medical school to try to create different opportunities for students, undergraduates alongside the medical students to do this work. So one of the things that the Medicine and Society minor aspires to is to be much more involved in the community moving forward. So stay tuned. There'll be lots of opportunities for you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions thus far?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Claire. I'm an undergrad here. And thanks for being on this panel today. I'm really excited to hear from you guys. Unfortunately, I was a little late, so I'm not sure if this was already covered. But I think in my perspective and from the physicians that I've talked to, advocacy is a really big part of the profession. Like not necessarily just like advocating for disadvantaged groups, although that certainly is what you seem to be talking about and very important, but just like advocating for each and every patient to get like the kind of care that they need. So I wonder like what kind of emphasis your school has put on this, and if you expected it, if like your expectations before you came to medical school have been met, or like if they're different in any way. Does that make sense?
You want to start us off, Luma, or I can go either way. So just kind of like a little background about like how I arrived to medical school, because I think that informed the perspective that I have. So I graduated college in 2013. And I'm like considered a non-traditional medical student, but I studied sociology and Spanish, social and economic justice. I was much more in like social justice advocacy, kind of nonprofit work more. I mean, I wasn't at all in like healthcare or medicine until probably like about like a couple of years before I went to medical school, because I was like, oh, I'm gonna do this. But so I kind of like came from a realm that it was just like, that was the work, all of the work centered on, like I worked kind of in health literacy and college access. And so when I started, you know, moving into a more medical realm, I was a little, I think, naive. I was like, oh yeah, everyone is interested in this. This is why people do medicine, because, you know, we're helping people in their most vulnerable. And I think I had to switch my perspective a little bit, that it wasn't all like that. And there absolutely is spaces that is like that. And I'm like learning, and it's really fun to meet people who are also in these spaces and have like this career that I want to emulate. But I definitely did have to like switch my perspective a little bit as I continued to move through like taking my prerequisites and you know, in this past year and a half or 2 years of medical school, that I have experienced like coming up against more like walls than I thought I would. And I think that's like, times are changing. I mean, times are always changing, but there's been, and you know, I don't want to speak for Luma, but I've experienced in the curriculum moments that I'm like, oh, this is not like, I'm like kind of left wanting a little bit more curriculum when it comes to advocacy, when it comes to treating patients that are, you know, not like cis white men, basically. And I've had to kind of explore that, I think, a little bit more on my own. And I think that for VTC is changing, and it's very open to change. It's just not, it's just like, it's, you know, it's coming a little, it's not there. It's not totally there yet. And I have to find kind of like other avenues to get that. Again, that being said, like I have met people who are my colleagues as classmates, and also physicians who are doing this amazing advocacy work that, you know, they are pushing us forward. And it's like wonderful to see and wonderful to learn from them.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I had a lot of ideas about medical school prior to actually entering that might have surprised me. So when we talk about like taking care of the whole patient, there are components of the patient interview, for example, that we learn about as we're getting started through training. But as we sort of get deeper and deeper on and closer to actually entering the clinics, I think it becomes apparent that there are a lot of constraints like time and the way that, you know, physicians are compensated, that sometimes can lead, it can kind of push us into putting things on the back burner, like religious and spiritual beliefs that might inform care, financial barriers that might inform care, literacy, all of those things that we actually, when we first practice interviewing a patient, we are taught to ask about all these things. But I think like those are the first things to go when we actually enter like the real life hospital setting. And so for me, I think I've just kind of tried to remain centered around that those components of a patient's care are just as important as all the other components. So that's just one thing that I've noticed going through this process that sort of surprised me.
Yeah, thank you for your answers. It sounds like, I mean, it sounds like physicians have a lot to think about, and like being in charge of this care team or like the head person, and then also focusing in on patients. So I feel like the aperture of your attention has to change really quickly. And so I understand how things can get lost in the middle.
Any other questions? Not right now. Okay, well, you guys can just jump in. Don't wait for me to ask you, but I'm wondering now, maybe we can shift a little bit and talk about some of the challenges to doing this kind of work. What are some of the concrete barriers? Macy, you already kind of referred to the curriculum. I'd love for you to talk about the research that you're doing, that we're doing. and kind of what that's meant to address in terms of gaps and barriers, and any other challenges that you all see in terms of trying to be a social justice advocate from within a medical school and within medicine itself would be great.
I can start. I think for me, kind of going along off your last question, one thing that has been a challenge that I didn't really consider prior to starting medical school is the traditional sort of apolitical role of the physician. And that's been really surprising for me, but I think it's rooted in the idea that a physician should be treating every single patient equally. But that doesn't really make sense because not every patient is the same, and we should be treating patients with equity in mind. And so that's one thing that has been a challenge, because there's sometimes a fear of actually delving into some of the political context that surrounds a patient care. So we talked about like structural barriers, we talked about some of those access or geographical barriers. That's one challenge, I think, that has sort of painted the culture of sparing politics within medical school. Another one is, and I don't know if this is a virtue of being at a small school or in Southwest Virginia, but there has not always been the infrastructure already in place to, you know, if we see a need or if we see something that could be improved, there has not always been the infrastructure to easily demand that change. And so that's like why I mentioned some of those individual students who have done that work, and it's made even more difficult when you're the first person to actually go through that process. And then the third thing that I've thought about a lot is the challenge of burnout and exhaustion. I think a lot of us have felt that way recently, but within the medical training, at least that I've gone through within the last 2 years, it's been a lot of sort of picking and choosing where you put your time and what you value. And if you're constantly in identifying these things that, you know, you want to change or that you're passionate about, sometimes it could be difficult to balance that along with like the rest of the workload and the demands of medical school. And I imagine that only gets greater as we continue on in this journey, but that's definitely a challenge.
I like echo everything that Luma is saying. And I think Luma and I have had many of our own conversations about this of, you know, medicine is just like such a weird and draining process, and you're like, so much is expected of you, and you just like can't not look like an idiot so many times because there's just so much things that you need to know. And I think that I've kind of been like reflecting on how, like Luma was commenting, I think 2 big things that I've kind of been reflecting on as I've progressed in school and like I'm trying to figure out what my identity as a future physician will look like is, one, this concept of being apolitical. I think that using like politics or professionalism can be a tool to be like silencing people's beliefs or advocacy work, and trying to kind of like figure out how I like can be like, you know, like strong in my beliefs and advocating. And then for kind of the being like exhausted, it's just like there's so many like testing and things to memorize and, you know, all of these things that is hard to like have bandwidth for other things. I do think the system is changing. I don't know how familiar y'all are with the medical process training. Like you have 3 big board exams, and the first board exam is called step 1, and it is at the end of your 2nd year. So Luma and I are winding up to take it soon. They have after our year, they're making it pass fail because the healthcare system is recognizing that there are things beyond, do you know like what chromosome mutation switches are happening in a disease process? Like there is more than that in healthcare. So they're making it pass fail in hopes that the curriculum, the pre-clerkship years can give people, I think, more space to explore advocacy work and things like that. So hopefully that is a kind of challenge that will hopefully change in the coming years. And then the final thing I want to comment on, which Dr. Hester was referring to, is Dr. Hester and I are working on a research project together that has had many iterations, but is in its most recent and hopeful like final iteration is examining how students interact with curriculum related to social determinants of health in medical school, and kind of what are factors that influence their interactions and perspectives on social determinants of health curriculum, because schools are more and more, it's becoming a part of medical school curriculum, but it's maybe not always effective, or some students, and I heard this from medical students throughout the country are kind of like, why are we learning this? So it's like, what do students bring to medical school that are going to allow them or interest them in interacting with the social determinants of health? So hoping to kind of figure out that piece of the barrier of changing curriculum and making effective curriculum for medical school. So catch us in a couple of years. Hopefully we'll have some information for you about it.
And I just wanted to point out a couple things quickly before we keep the conversation going on, based on what Luma was saying, this idea that we should treat everyone equally, even though everybody is not coming from the same background, is rooted in a kind of understanding of equality as universality, which kind of ties into the apolitical idea that we tend to think that science doesn't have any politics to it, right? That science is neutral and apolitical. But of course, as a science and technology studies professor, I can tell you that's not true. Science is littered and rife with social values, but also that's an idea of equality of input, right? That we treat everyone the same, but of course we've already established that everybody's not the same, but that's not going to get us the equality of outcome. And that, I think, is ultimately what Luma was referring to in terms of equity, right? The difference between equality and equity. Equity is that everybody ends up with the same outcome, right? Based on, an idea that we've treated them differently in order to get them to the same outcome, right? And so that's one thing I wanted to say, also, that science is not neutral. And then the third is that some of the things that Macy and Luma are saying, I think, are relevant to and bear on the decision to decide which medical school to attend, because some medical schools already have inbuilt infrastructures, right? There's so much going on that, students are spoiled for choice, and some medical schools don't have anything. And so it's an uphill road, student by student, to really push for that. So as you, Kara, and Claire are sort of deciding where to go, and we're going to talk about this. We have for our final panel this semester, we're going to talk about this, and I'm going to bring some students who've struggled and hand wrung about where they should go. Should they do public health or medicine? Which medical school should they go to? And, that is something to consider, right? I had a student who really wanted to go to Pritzker, was sure she was going to end up in Chicago, from the outside was like, this is my ideal school, like done deal, that's where I'm headed. And she went to interview there and she's like, they can talk the talk, but they're not walking the walk. It looks good on paper, but it's not great. And then she got a free ride to Mayo and didn't take it, and ended up going to Harvard Med, and she's just like involved in a gazillion things. And so it really just depends like what you're into. You want to be a DO, you want to be an MD, and what the schools offer. I have another student that stayed here, and she really does not like it. She's at BCom, and she just does not like it because, again, a lot of talking the talk, but not walking the walk. So anyway, I just want to kind of put that out there because that will bear on how exhausted you are trying to, build that infrastructure for the next generation. So, okay, so on that note, I'm wondering if Luma and Macy, you guys can talk about structural barriers. So again, back to the curriculum. What is in the curriculum? What's not in the curriculum? What do you think? What would you like to see in the curriculum? What happens when you're taught things around the social determinants of health, or some of the more kind of social justice terms or uses of medicine that you guys are like, oh, I wish we could do better, or, oh God, I'd really like it if they did this instead of that. So maybe you could talk about that too.
I can start us off. Dr. Hester and I have had many conversations about curriculum because this is the research and kind of what my experiences have been. And obviously I'm speaking to my experience at Virginia Tech Carillion's medical school. And I have friends at other medical schools that I kind of like share, if anyone's interested, kind of what their experience is. There is, again, like I said, I observe a shift in some ways, in curriculum, we've started a part of our kind of like core curriculum is health science systems, I think. Yeah. And so
it's health system science, I think.
Health system science, thank you. Health system science and interprofessional, but kind of like combined it all, HSSIP. They are starting to utilize that time in the curriculum to talk about social determinants of health, to talk about healthcare access and kind of like ethics, things of that nature, which is a wonderful first step. We are the first class that have experienced the curriculum. So, I recognize that these take iterations and these take practice. In its practice that I've experienced, there definitely have been moments that, I'm like, oh, I don't know if this is accurate, or a lot of times they have, and I don't know, I'm sure that there are reasons like financial or political reasons that they'll sometimes have physicians teaching these courses who maybe areas of expertise is not this, ethics or social determinants of health or whatever it might be. And obviously I enjoy the physician perspective on these things, because then, they have the benefit of saying like, this is what it's like in actual clinical practice. But I think that for some of these like groundwork information, it'd be really helpful to have people who are actual experts like Dr. Hester, who's like in this field, who can like really like change the way we are thinking about these things. So that's kind of one example of seeing it, I see them slowly making the space for it, but again, it's like in practice, it's maybe not always great. And, there's been something like clinical science. I'll let Luma share if she's had any experiences about it, and I can add any clinical science experiences that I've had that are maybe lacking.
Yeah, I definitely echo what you're saying, Macy. Within the HSSIP curriculum, it's been really exciting to see that come to light. But in terms of the clinical science, that one of the things that comes to mind is as we practice patient encounters, because we haven't entered the hospital yet, a lot of our training has been with people who speak English fluently, who are of usually a white and actually older adult demographic. And it's been really important for our training, but one thing I would really like to see more of, and trying to, I would hope to do more work on that while I'm at VTC, is bringing in, interpreter services for students to learn how to interact with interpreters, how to interact with patients who come from a different cultural background, even different ages, different sexual orientations, or gender orientations. Those I think are pockets that would be really, really useful to us to have at this early stage, just so that we can go on to be future physicians that can serve all different kinds of patients, and just become more well-rounded. But I think that has been one thing that's been lacking a little bit.
I have kind of a follow-up question to something like kind of a theme that has been coming by, and just kind of like humanizing science and how science is not apolitical. And I think that VTC, like from my perspective, has a reputation of being like a research-driven institution. I think tech values that a lot. And not to like discredit the humanities research that goes on, but I think that I've heard a lot about like scientific research. I wonder, like, do you think that there's good work being done by the students and faculty at VTC to, like, because I feel like you are studying anatomy and you're studying genomes and you're studying, I don't know, like T cells, but it's kind of hard to remember where it all is all coming from and the humanity of it all. So how do you guys kind of deal with that? Have you had the opportunity to start, or is that not really yet part of your training?
I can comment on this just because my research that I'm doing with Dr. Hester is VTC has a requirement of research because it is a very research-driven institution that you have to complete like a 3-ish year, basically like a graduation requirement through your years. And I have done the project that I discussed is the one that is my my graduation requirement project, and I have met some resistance because it is more of a social science than a basic science or a clinical science project. So I've had to kind of had edits and switching of kind of what it is, because the research, kind of previous research that we were trying to do, although very valid in our eyes, was not like fulfilling requirements that were based on more basic science research. The person who runs a research domain has been incredibly supportive and is like very like an advocate for the work that we're doing. And we're still like functioning within the confines of this much more biomedical research. So hopefully that's changing, because, you know, they're seeing the validity and the utility in that type of research. But that's been my like personal experience in that.
Yeah, and I will say, while we don't have a lot of projects that are centered around that, I think a lot of that is also because medical school is so geared towards getting us into residency. I wonder if part of that is related to residencies, finding validity and finding value in those types of research projects. So I hope that that will change. But I feel like sometimes the things that we learn about in medical school or our curriculums are built on what will make us the best candidates for residency applications. And it's unfortunate because there are so many other projects that we need, like Macy and Dr. Hester's projects. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that I think that that's a big underlying factor.
It sounds like it never ends. Just trying to be qualified for the next thing. Thanks for your answers.
So Kara and Claire, I want to just open it up. Do you guys have any other questions or any things that you want to add to this conversation? Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so I heard that maybe Macy mentioned how a lot of people were really inspired to action because of the Black Lives Matter movement that like really gained a lot of momentum over the summer. And I think that like, not just in medicine, although because of COVID-19, there's a big magnifying glass on the healthcare system right now. But everywhere people are kind of like reevaluating themselves. And something that the country is looking to is Dr. Fauci. I don't know like how much you guys look up to him or know about his like history working with the AIDS epidemic. But like something I've noticed is that he kind of like has done work to acknowledge like discrepancies in care between BIPOC communities in the United States, talking about like death disparities in the COVID deaths and even vaccine distribution more recently. But, and I mean, like, I'm not following him around, so I don't really know what the work he's doing behind the scenes, but I wonder like, how prevalent do you think like performative allyship is in the field? And I know it's so deeply rooted that it's kind of hard to make change, but do you guys have any thoughts on that?
You're gonna go first, Lima. Or I can, whatever.
Go for it. Go for it.
Well, I went first last time, so we're tallying it, of course. So I think that's a wonderful question, and something like I have been like reflective on for myself, like as a white person in this space and like trying to be an advocate, but like I'm an incredibly privileged white person. So it's like, what am I bringing from my experiences and my like ideas of the world, and how my ideas and have been shaped by my experiences, and being like really turning a critical eye on myself, which is a constant, like constantly working and making mistakes and like owning those mistakes and just like moving forward. So that is like as an individual in these spaces, as an institution, and again, like, sorry, for an individual, like I hope to not be performative, and I try to like, when I'm taking action, it's like, why am I taking action? Is this to like look good? Is this to actually serve a purpose? and like, what are my like actual true motivations, but being very honest with myself, because I've absolutely done performative allyship in my past. And it's like, okay, like, you know, we need to be growing and I need to be improving on that. On the institution side, there was a really big push. So Sara Yosef, which is the LUMA's co-president of REMA, the organization, with 2 other students in our class, Kenneth Young and Chukwemeka Wakaname, they wrote a letter after the George Floyd murder by police, listing, you know, these are issues that we have with this institution, and we want to see change. There are 3 Black students that are classmates, and it was like an incredible letter, and like, yeah, beautifully, just like powerful and beautifully done. And based on that letter, the Virginia Tech Carillion School of Medicine created a task force with these subgroups that over the kind of end of summer into the fall, early winter, worked in these subgroups in admissions, in preclinical curriculum, in clinical curriculum, in community engagement, in like student support, faculty development. I think that's like most of them, trying to figure out action steps that the medical school can take to make change. Is it performative or not? Like, I hope not. And I hope that things that are actually important come from it. The changes are kind of like being reviewed right now and figuring out what needs to be fit in the budget and things like that. I like participated in part of that process, and there were moments that I think were really wonderful. And then I do think there are moments that were performative. And I think it's like, kind of, we need to continue to hold these institutions accountable for something being performative. And yeah, it happens, and it's like, I think it's going to continue to happen. So it's definitely a work in progress, and like still trying to figure out what is going to come from it that's actually meaningful.
Yeah, thanks. That it's really encouraging just to hear that like all these changes are happening, and that makes me good about like how our country is like trying forward. Lost my thoughts, sorry.
Luma, did you want to share some thoughts about that question as well?
Yeah, sure. What a wonderful and relevant question. I think it's so tough in terms of like identifying whether something is performative or not, especially when you're like evaluating something as large as an institution. But I think something that's sort of come up time and time again when I'm sort of looking at these different movements is like, one, are the people who are most knowledgeable on this topic the ones who are speaking on it and the ones whose voices are amplified. So I think Macy had touched on this before, like in our social determinants of health classes, like who is actually sharing this knowledge, whose voices are getting elevated. And then another thing is this movement or action or initiative is like kind of like a hot like buzzword recently at our school. Is this initiative like centering the people who it's going to affect? So I think also kind of recognizing that within medical school, there's a lot of emphasis on achievements and accolades and things that will, again, advance us towards that next level of residency. And so it can be really difficult to figure out, is this action actually for the genuine purpose of like advancing this specific cause? And that's like something that also I'm trying to work on, you know, identifying, figuring out. And something that sort of ties in with that, which your question made me think of, and also goes along with the idea of burnout and exhaustion, is I've had to figure out what are all the different avenues of activism that I can take part in. And sort of acknowledging that different people and different students at different stages of their lives can't like all take the exact same action, but at the same time, there are so many like avenues of activism and all of them are worthwhile. So whether that's like a financial contribution, conversations, sort of like using somebody using their platform to make comments on something, whether that's at the like administrative or policy level or student organization level. I think switching between those avenues and also giving people space to explore how they can best contribute has been also really key in, one, avoiding burnout, and two, acknowledging like the different actions that are not performative.
Okay, do you guys have any more questions? Kara, do you want to jump in? Is there anything that you've been waiting to say or ask?
I'm really interested in the program you're talking about with the refugees. Would you mind speaking a little more about that? And maybe like some of the problems that you see within the refugee population?
Yeah, definitely. And I was excited to see that. I think the event after this is about refugee mental health. Is that right, Dr. Hester? Yeah, so I can speak to within Roanoke, there are anywhere between 80 to 250 refugee families that are settled per year, and there are a lot of different nations represented. I think coming up is going to be mostly from the Democratic Republic of Congo, but we also have a lot of populations from Afghanistan, Syria, Nepal. So a lot of languages and nationalities represented. And because of that, there are a lot of local organizations in Roanoke that are working towards supporting these refugee families. So one of them I mentioned is Commonwealth Catholic Charities. They do a lot of refugee resettlement in the area. There's Casa Latina, which mostly caters to a Latinx population. So whether refugee or not, they do like a food drive all the time, like I think monthly, and sort of support a lot of different needs there. There's the Roanoke Refugee Partnership, which is the most consistent partner with the School of Medicine. And we had one of their members, her name is Lakshmi Patel. She's the one who helps every year with creating this health fair that I mentioned. And then there's also something called a Refugee Dialogue Group, which I think is usually on a monthly basis. It brings together, and Dr. Hester, maybe I think you've been involved in this, so maybe you can speak more to it, but essentially it's a gathering at all different levels, whether it's like school or city levels, with these local organizations. And Dr. Parmeshwar also sits in on it, and they just sort of discuss, okay, what is the state of affairs for our refugee population? What are their needs? What is sort of the landscape going to look like a year from now? And based on all of those conversations of all those groups that are way more knowledgeable than us medical students in this landscape, based on that, we as a student group kind of try to fill in any way that we can. And so Macy mentioned the International Health Clinic. They're amazing in that they're like centering along the clinical needs of these of all sorts of different kinds of patients, but also we're the Refugee Immigrant Medical Association is looking at maybe like more non-medical needs. It can also include medical topics, but something like food, for example, or access, stuff like that.
And I'll just say that I'm the associate director for our newly formed Center for Refugee, Migrant, and Displacement Studies. At Virginia Tech, we just established that center. And we have been partnering with folks like Commonwealth Catholic Charities and with the Roanoke Refugee Partnership, but there's also a Blacksburg Refugee Partnership, and they often recruit students to tutor in the local schools. So part of what they do is they work with the Roanoke City school system, and they, it used to be that the tutors would go to people's houses. Now I think they're just going into the school settings and doing stuff online, but there's a lot of support. So if you're interested in getting involved also with the refugee community, we've got lots of different initiatives going on. I'm also developing, in addition to running the Medicine Society minor, I'm developing and will be running the Displacement Studies minor, which is focused on refugees and migrants. So there'll be curriculum attached to that. We've established a statewide research consortium that really is about pushing for curriculum around refugees and migrants across the state. And we've been working really actively with some policymakers and also with some local folks to work on labor issues, because a lot of refugees they come as physicians, for example, but they can't work here. So they're underemployed as taxi drivers or whatever. And so if you're interested in any of that, because I'm located in the Medicine Society and I'm also in the displacement studies, it's very, I'm well sort of placed to be able to work with these different organizations and to find opportunities for students like you and Claire, if you guys are interested in getting involved in that.
Yeah, thank you. Where can I find are you gonna send out information about that? Like the tutoring program or?
If you email me, Kara, after this, I can hook you up with Dr. Brett Shadle, who is in the Department of History. He's the chair of history. And he's he's one of the ones who oversees the assignments for tutoring, and they're always looking for tutors. The other thing that we're going to be doing, we started it, and then because of COVID, we stopped, but we will be doing this summer is running a podcast. So I will be in charge of the podcast and looking for undergraduates to help. And we interview people just like we're doing here, and then we'll post the podcast so that people can learn more about some of the challenges and some of the opportunities for working with refugees and migrants and other displaced groups in Virginia. And so that's something that we have been working with people all over the state, and we'll continue to collect interviews and then put them up on our podcast website. So that's another initiative. If you're interested, you can just email me and we can sit down and talk and see what works for you. So we have about 7 minutes. I just want to ask Macy and Luma if there's anything that you haven't talked about, any advice that you want to offer to students who want to go into medical school, things about how you chose Carillion. Was it your only option? Did you have other options? What you think you want to specialize in, how you make those decisions, anything that you think undergraduates who are up and coming and want to be in your shoes should know or think about.
Go ahead, Luma.
Okay. So first of all, please feel free to, Dr. Hester has my information, so feel free to email me if you guys have any other specific questions in terms of the pathway to medical school. But something that I thought about in terms of starting medical school and finding the right one is how susceptible is my school to feedback? And that's been one thing that's been really fantastic about VTC as being such a small school. First of all, the class size being small has been just it's just been critical, I think, to creating and fostering these really meaningful relationships with attendings, getting opportunities to shadow, which has been really important in terms of thinking about specialties, research like we talked about. So the small class size and intimate setting has been great. And it's also lended itself to a nice cultural or nice environment that is susceptible to feedback. So, they're always asking us, how can we improve? What can we change to make your experience better? So that's something that I thought about a lot. And I think I need to think a little bit more. Macy, why don't you go next and I'll think on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Luma, please, Dr. Hester, feel free to share my email. Happy to answer any questions, even as the years come that y'all are engaging in this process. So for choosing Virginia Tech, Carillion, also a small school size was very big because I didn't have as extensive a science background. I knew that I would need a lot of support to get through the academics, which I have at Virginia Tech Carillion and has absolutely been critical in getting me to where I need to be going. And also kind of when I was interviewing at places and talking to students and then making a decision about where to go, again, like Luma, it was very much like I was hearing from other places that I was maybe going to go about how the students were treated like a number, basically. They didn't know the students. They weren't open to feedback. They weren't ready to advocate for us if we needed to take time off or we had extenuating circumstances or whatever it might be. And I heard that a lot at other schools, and then at Virginia Tech, Carillion, all the students that I had talked to were very much the opposite. So that was huge because this process is very, very difficult. And, life is happening at the same time, but it's kind of hard to deal with life at the same time. So it's nice to be at a place that if you need a little bit more support or space or time or something, they can be flexible in doing that. And for general advice, I mean, just about medical things in general, ask for help, ask for help if it's academic, if it's for mental health, if it's anything. Like, most people don't know what's going on. Like, you know, people like to front that they're like, oh, this is easy and I know what's going on, but like basically everyone, if not everyone, is like have hard days, feel like an idiot sometimes, like just have no idea what's going on. It's the nature of the beast, and just like ask for help and like be willing to be vulnerable, even that's really difficult. And like, you will find the more you do it, A, the more you learn and grow, and B, the more people are like, I'm feeling the same way, or, you know, I am, you know, this was like, you doing that was like helpful in me doing that also. So just like really, you know, it's a long process. It's very hard, and just like be okay with, you know, asking for help as you need.
Good. That's super important. Imposter syndrome. We all suffer from it, right? So, okay. So we're pretty much at the end of our time. I don't know, Clara, Kara, did you guys have anything last burning that you wanted to ask or say? You're welcome to always reach out to me if, you know, there's other things. Just give you a sec here. Anything you wanted to ask or say? No. How about Luma, Macy, anything else? No. Okay.
Got it. It's
Well,
gonna be great.
I just
Go ahead.
Sorry, just wanted to say thank you for your time, guys. You guys were both so well spoken, engaging, willing to answer our questions, and certainly role models as med students. So good luck with all of your advocacy work. It sounds amazing.
Mhm. Yeah, good. So Luma and Macy, thank you so much for being here today. And Kara and Claire, please feel free to reach out anytime. Now you know who I am. Please send me an email, Kara, and we'll talk more about some opportunities for you. And you know, as you move forward, I hope you guys can join our other sessions next month. As Luma mentioned, we're going to be talking about refugee mental health, which is something that medicine also doesn't talk a lot about. You know, they're focused on sort of, you know, the neck down, as it were. You know, the body, not the mind or whatever. And so we're going to kind of be talking about that and build in some other activities, maybe film nights or whatever, and then outreach activities starting in the fall. So stay tuned for all of that. All right. Okay. Their contact information is in the chat. If you want to contact Luma and Macy, they've generously shared their contact information. So with that, we're done. But I just really appreciate your time, all of you today. Lovely to have this conversation.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Good luck.
All right. Take care, guys. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.